Hi there, and welcome to another week of the Good News according to Job. I hope you enjoyed last week as we considered Bildad and all that he had to say and how it got us to really contemplate when we speak truths, are they applicable? And as we consider how those words and the things that Bildad said to Job really got us to hopefully wrestle with, was it applicable to Job? And now this week we turn to Job's response. So we are turning to Job 9 and 10 as Job responds not only to Bildad, but also as he starts to contemplate and wrestle with God, who God is in light of his circumstance, and he asks more questions and really begins to wrestle with some deep questions. So if you've read this section, perhaps you've picked up on some of that. Perhaps you've seen there's a whole array of different ideas coming through in this section. And as we turn to it, I hope that we can highlight some of those ideas. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get into everything and all the little details, but hopefully as we go, we will be able to bring out some of the ideas that Job does convey, and be able to then work from there and see how that lays further foundations as we go into the rest of the book. That these thoughts, these ideas are building on one another, and that it helps us to really wrestle with ourselves as we wrestle with Job and contemplate in many ways, what do we think? How do we perceive things? How do we understand who God is? And is our understanding greater than God? And these are things that we need to wrestle with. And Job causes us to wrestle with that. How much weight do we place on our own understanding, our own wisdom, versus who God is and what he shows us? As for this week, there's a couple of sections, and I thought that the best way to just get through this is to just list the sections that we are going to go through. And the reason for this is because it's such a long section, it will help us to be able to just navigate a little bit better through this section of Job. So to begin, the first section that we will consider is Job 9 verse 1 to 4. And Job 9 verse 1 to 4 begins by really contemplating and weighing up mortality, or human mortality, against God's wisdom and power. So it's man's mortality and God's wisdom, or immortality, or however you want to put it. But it's this contrast between man and our limitations, and God and his vastness, as we'll see. Job uses this language. The next section is 5 to 10, and verses 5 to 10 conveys the idea of God's wonder. The wonder of God's creation, the wonder of God, and how he holds these things together and has created these things in his wisdom. So there is a picture of wonder, as we'll look at that just briefly in a little bit. The next section then is 11 to 24. That looks a little bit more at the justice of God. And the section that follows that is 25 to 31, and that looks at the condition of life. And this is particularly pertaining to Job, but it also has implications and truths for us as human beings. And then the next section that Job unpacks is verse 32 to 35, and that's really the question of, or the longing for a mediator, and that we'll give a little bit more attention to toward the end of this video. Then the next chapter, we have another 4 sections. The first is 1 to 7, verses 1 to 7, and that we can title according to what Job has used there, and he calls that the bitterness of soul. And so he speaks from the bitterness of his soul as he speaks there. And then 8 to 12 is really a question more than a statement, but it's the question of, you made me, and there's a bunch of questions that flow from that kind of question that we can ask on that section. You made me. How? Why? For what reason? And then verses 13 to 17 looks at God's concealed heart. And so as we consider that section, Job uses the language that God has a concealed heart in a certain aspect, and we'll just briefly consider what he says there. And then the final section is 18 to 22, and that highlights then this plea to relent, and we will also just glance at that toward the end. So those are the sections that we can kind of break this up into, and hopefully we'll navigate and find our way through it a little bit better and be able to see how those play off of one another and lead into the next thought. So we'll start with the first section is chapter 9 verse 1 to 4, and there we have this introduction. I'll read that for us. It says, "Then Job replied, 'Indeed, I know that this is true, but how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? Though they wished to dispute with him, they could not answer him one time out of 1,000. His wisdom is profound, his power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed?'" And so the first section really poses this question that Job has. He says that, yes, we are mortals, but who are we as mortals? How can we as mortals prove our innocence before God? How can we look to God as created beings, creatures that he has created, and prove our own innocence before our Creator? That becomes the initial question that Job asks. And on the backdrop of that, Job then points out the fact that God is incredibly wise and incredibly powerful, as he says there. His wisdom is profound, his power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed? So Job is aware of God's wisdom, of God's power, and that we as creatures are under that. We as creatures are mortal. We are mortal, and when it comes to proving our innocence, we are ultimately trying to prove our innocence to our own Creator, which seems rather peculiar to think through that in that way. And this then leads to the next section, verses 5 through to 10. And 5 through to 10 paint these pictures that Job uses of creation, of the foundations of the earth, the pillars of the earth shaking, of the constellations. And so just to draw our attention to one section of that is going to be the last section, verse 9 and 10. So let's read there quickly and see what Job has to say there. He says this: "He is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted." And so the reason why I'm drawing our attention first to this is that this plays a role later on in Job again. When God responds, God actually highlights this again for Job. So here Job is talking about it, but God's going to bring Job's attention back to this. But at this point, what Job is considering and weighing up is that this is the God who has made these constellations. He has shaken the earth. He has done things in unfathomable ways. He has not only created and constructed the constellations in the night sky, but he has also done incredible miraculous things that go beyond our ability to understand and even begin to reason. So this is the type of God that Job is contemplating and considering. This is who his God is. This is the God who is beyond our understanding, as he is beyond wisdom, or beyond our wisdom, that his wisdom far exceeds our understanding and our wisdom, as well as he is powerful enough to shake the foundations of the earth and create the constellations in the night sky. This is the God who is immensely powerful, and all that he does goes beyond our ability to fathom and comprehend. So up front, Job has really given us this perspective of our position as mortal beings in light of not only our position as mortal beings, but our position in light of innocence, or even guilt for that matter, before our Creator, who is all-powerful, all-wise, and is incredibly greater than what we can ever imagine, even for that matter. The next section that we'll turn to is verses 11 to 24, which glance at the justice of God. And so the first part that we will just take a look at is what he says here in verse 11 and 12. He says, when he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? And so the first picture that Job really gives us here is that God is, for him, is beyond what he can see. God functions and does things beyond what he can see and perceive. So those two words working together it's not simply a sight thing that you can see what's in front of you, but a perception. It's an understanding, again, a depth of sight. And so Job really is wrestling with the fact that God functions and acts and does things in a way that is imperceptible, that moves beyond what we can, what moves beyond what we can always understand or see or reason or think about in a way that is that actually computes with our limitations. So Job is saying he hasn't been able to see how God functions or perceive fully how God functions. And then we need to turn to the last, to verse 19 there. Verse 19 and 20, it says, if it is a matter of strength, he is mighty, and if it is a matter of justice, who can challenge him? Even if I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. If I were blameless, it would pronounce me guilty. And so at this point, what Job is really saying here is he's saying, if it was a matter of strength, God is mighty. But in contrast with that, he then says, and if it is a matter of justice, who can challenge him? So just as God is incredibly strong and mighty, more strong and more mighty than any of us could be, he also then highlights, by using that as a contrast, to say his justice exceeds our justice. His understanding and wisdom of justice goes beyond what we perceive and understand justice to be. And then in verse 20 he says, even if I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. So this is a very interesting statement that Job is saying here, that even if he was innocent, not that he's denying that he's not blameless, and he will go and say that he is blameless in a little bit, but the fact that he would say that even if I was innocent, my mouth would condemn me. And then he goes on, if I were blameless, it would pronounce me guilty. So he's saying, even if I was innocent or blameless, I would still end up pronouncing myself guilty. My own words cannot set me right. My own words will actually condemn me more than save me. My words can't do that. And so in verse 21 he says, although I am blameless, which is an interesting thing. He's not denying his blamelessness before God. But he then says, although I am blameless, I have no concern for myself. I despise my own life. So that doesn't contradict what we are told in the beginning. Job is simply asking a question in verses 19 and 20 to really get us to think what our mouths have the capacity to do. And rather than to do the positive or to be mighty or powerful, he's actually saying, well, our own mouths, if given free rein, will rather condemn us than anything else. And then Job considers his life, and he says, but even though he is blameless, he doesn't consider his life. He says, I despise my own life, in actual fact. And then he carries on and he says, it is all the same. That is why I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. When a land falls into the hands of the wicked, he blindfolds its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? So at this point, it sounds strong what Job is saying, and we need to just glance at this and consider it. Job is not outright saying here that God turns his face away from the wicked and allows them to get away with injustice, and that he turns his face and he laughs when the innocent are suffering. He's not saying that. Notice that it ends with a question. He says, if it is not he, then who is it? And so it is a contemplation more than an accusation. And yes, there is that undertone that he is suggesting that God is the one that does it. But he is weighing it up and saying, if I consider these things, if I consider that God is in control and that God is just and that his justice exceeds my own understanding of justice, then when these things happen, who is in control? Who is there? And so when you ask the question, if it is not he, if it is not God that is there when the innocent suffer and when the wicked get away with injustice, then who is there? So it's not that Job is outright saying something here that is, it sounds harsh and it comes across as quite a harsh thing, and most of us probably wouldn't say it. But what Job is doing here is he's considering and exploring the extent of God's justice, of who he is as a just God, and how that fits in with, for example, what Bildad has said from Bildad's own tradition. So if Bildad is true in what he's saying, that Job has done something wrong and that's why he is suffering, then the question is Job, as Job has pointed out here, is he suffering perhaps because he's innocent rather than he's wrong, because he says he's blameless. So here we've got this consideration, this contemplation, this wrestling, and it should stir us. It should really get us a little bit uncomfortable as Job says this, and get us to consider a little bit deeper. What do we understand God's justice to be? Does God's justice have to fit what we understand justice to be? Does God's justice have to look like what we would accept or condemn? How does God's justice work? Does God's justice have to conform to our standard, or does our justice have to conform to God's standard? So these are some of the thoughts that start coming out as we start considering this in Job. And these are important things because this is what Job is going to do. It's going to get us to really ask these tough questions and wrestle through it. And at the end, as we work through it, we will hopefully get to where God does respond, and it comes into focus all the more. The difference between what Job is saying, what his friends are saying, and what God will say. So hold on, hang in there, and hopefully as we go, Job will get us to question and ask enough questions and wrestle with enough things, as well as his friends. And by the time we get to what God has to say, it helps us to understand who God is and how his wisdom functions all the more. And so that's that section that we're just going to leave it at that point and consider it there. If you have more questions, maybe we can have a discussion at another point. But as for that, it's going to unfold, and there's going to be a lot more that will be said. And this isn't the only time that there's going to be things said that's going to scratch at us and leave us feeling a little bit agitated, because the book of Job does that with us. The next section, though, that we are going to turn to just briefly is verse 25 to 31. And there, as I've said, is the condition of life. So it starts there in verse 25. It says, "My days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. They skim past like boats of papyrus, like eagles swooping down on their prey." And so this picture that is painted here is there's a swiftness of life. It's quick, it's fast, similar to what Job said previously, that his life is like a weaver's shuttle. So it's fast, it moves quickly, and so he goes on to really contemplate and consider his life and the condition of his life. He says there in verse 29 to 31, "Since I am already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Even if I washed myself with soap and my hands with cleansing powder, you would plunge me into a slime pit so that even my clothes would detest me." And so this is what he's feeling, what he's experiencing. This is the condition that he's in, not only physically, but also emotionally. It's his heart that he's beginning to expose and share here all the more. But at this point, the focus then shifts, and we get to verses 32 to 35. And I'm going to come back to this because I think it's quite phenomenal that what Job has to say here. So before we look at this, let's move on to verse 1 to 7 of chapter 10. Where he begins, and he just says this in the start. He says, I loathe my very life, therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out of the bitterness of my soul. And so Job begins and he unpacks his heart, what he feels, what he's experiencing. As he carries on in verse 2, I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppose me? To spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked. And so Job is he's speaking here, as he says, from his bitterness that is in his soul. He's speaking from the anguish that he mentioned in the previous section where he spoke, the anguish of his soul, the bitterness of his soul, and this is now reoccurring as he speaks honestly about what he feels, what he's experiencing. And then the next section, if we move along a little bit faster, just to verse 8 and 8 to 12. And I want to read this for us because it's quite beautiful what Job says here. He says, your hands shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Clothe me with skin and flesh and knit me together with bones and sinews? You gave me life and showed me kindness, and in your providence watched over my spirit. And so at this point, Job is considering how God has created him. He's saying, Lord, you created me. You made me. I am part of your creation. I am molded by you. And so this is why it becomes a bit of a question more than just a contemplation. He's saying, you made me. Why did you make me? Why? And so as we move into the next section, 13 to 17, it unfolds why he's asking this. He says in verse 13, but this is what you concealed in your heart, and I know that this was in your mind. If I sinned, you would be watching me and would not let my offense go unpunished. If I am guilty, woe to me. Even if I am innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my affliction. If I hold my head high, you stalk me like a lion and again display your awesome power against me. You bring new witnesses against me and increase your anger toward me, and your forces come against me, wave upon wave. And so what he is actually saying here, from the previous section to this section, he's saying, Lord, you made me. God, you created me. And yet you bring wave upon wave of accusation or of forces against me. And so when he looks at his life, at having been made and molded by God, he is overweighed by this feeling that God has created him, knowing that he would do this, that God knew. But as he says in verse 13, but this is what you concealed in your heart, and I know that this was your mind. And what he is suggesting there is that this must have been something that you had known when you created me, that I would face this suffering, that I would face this hardship. And then verse 18, which is the last section, that kind of leads into the last section. Verse 18 says, why then did you bring me out of the womb? God, if you knew that I was going to face this hardship and this suffering, why did you bring me out of the womb? Why did you allow me to be born into this world? And he asks a little bit further, why couldn't I not have gone from womb to grave? And so Job is really wrestling with the tension of having to suffer and the pain and the anguish of his soul and the reality that God created him, knowing who he is creating and what would happen to him. And he's saying, if that is the case, why? Why did you allow that to happen? And so almost even the question that's in the middle of the previous section of innocence and guilt go out the window as Job begins to consider just his very existence at the hand of God. And then the rest of this last section becomes a real plea to God, a plea for God to relent, a plea for God to stop afflicting him, to give him a moment joy in what's left of this incredibly short life that he has, and to just give him a moment to breathe before he dies. And so Job really gets to the end of himself again here, where he turns to God and he says, I can't bear this. This is too painful. And you hear him speaking from the bitterness of his soul, the pain, the anguish that he's experiencing. But there is something of a joy in this passage, something that's incredible that Job does say. And at this point, it may seem somewhat insignificant to Job and his story, but there is incredible significance if we read it for ourselves today and just consider what Job asks for. So let's turn back to chapter 9, verse 32 to 35, and just read what he says there. He says, "He is not a mere mortal like me, that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot." And so at this point, Job looks at his circumstance. In the middle of his response, he looks to the situation in front of him. He looks to the reality that in this courtroom that is painted for us here in Job 9 and 10, this picture of all sorts of ideas of guilt and innocence, of justice, and standing before this incredibly powerful judge, Job looks to God and he says, if only there was a way that I could stand here before you. Verses 33, he says, 33 and 34, if only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. And so Job is asking on one level that someone would be able to mediate, that the suffering, this hardship, this pain and affliction would come to an end. But what's so incredible for us today is that out of what Job is asking for here, longing for, we see that this picture of a mediator is fulfilled. And we see it today in Jesus Christ, how God sent his one and only Son to die on the cross for us, to be that mediator for us, to take the punishment, to take the rod that we deserve, to take that away, so that we can, as Job says, so that we can, someone that can stand between us, someone to bring us together. And so we see this, that through what Job is saying here, Job's heart, his longing in Job 9 and 10, at least at this point, is that he could stand with God in his presence, that if there is anything that God has against him, that it's dealt with by a mediator. And so that Job longs for at this point, that his afflictions would be taken away, that God wouldn't afflict him, but not so that he lives comfortably and that he is no longer experiencing pain, but so that he can stand with God, that they can stand in this courtroom setting, that they can stand in one another's company, and God is not going to afflict him or hurt him or harm him. And Job then no longer has to fear as he says, that he would not be so that his terror would frighten me no more. And so this is Job's longing here in Job 9 and 10, is that despite his soul's bitterness and anguish, his real longing is that he could actually stand with in the presence of God, and that his heart may come into the presence of God, that his life could be in the company of God, that there would be a relationship, that there would be someone to deal with the legality, the issues between the two of them. And so this is part of what Job is really wrestling with here. But it's good news for us, because when we look at it, we don't even compare to Job. We are afflicted because of our sinfulness, because of our wrongdoing, because of all the things that we fail to get right. And not in the sense that we are afflicted by suffering, but that we are afflicted by sin and death. That these things, the only way that they can be removed is through the power of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And so Jesus Christ comes as that mediator to deal with the judgment that awaits us with God, and that he removes that judgment, that the judgment of guilt or sin is removed, and that we can enter into the presence of our Lord and Savior, and in one sense really get to experience what Job is longing for here. And so that's quite a beautiful image to see that there is this good news wrapped up in what Job is longing for here. Job is longing for the good news of a mediator, and we today have that in Jesus Christ. So I hope that this has helped you to really consider and just wrestle with what Job is wrestling with. Maybe you find yourself in the same boat, wrestling with some of these thoughts, wrestling about God's wisdom, wrestling about his power, wrestling about how he is the maker of all creation, wrestling with his justice, trying to understand how his justice works and why our justice doesn't work or turns a blind eye. And where is God in light of that? And hopefully instead of trying to come to those answers, that our priority, our main goal is the longing to be in his presence, the longing to no longer be concerned about our own lives and well-being here on earth and how we can live a comfortable life, but rather with the reality that God has given us a mediator in his Son Jesus Christ, and that through Jesus Christ we can stand guilt-free, innocent in this courtroom that Job is standing in, and that when we are there in that setting, that Christ is our mediator, and that we are counted as innocent, as righteous, as blameless, but not as Job is, but far more blameless, perfectly blameless, as Christ is blameless. And so I hope that's good news for you. I hope that fills you with a joy and an excitement, and that that as you consider that, as you wrestle through that the rest of Job will get you to wrestle and think through all of those various thoughts. So I hope that this will encourage you and challenge you, and continue to read through these sections, continue to read through Job 9 and 10, and until next week, we'll then turn and look at Zophar in chapter 11, and I really hope that you'll continue to work through it and wrestle with us, and have a great week, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers. Bye.